So today's daf is daf ayin tes. Ha'omer l'shivchaso. So a man says to his shivcha, who's muberesh, she's pregnant, and he's now being mishacher her, which makes her into a bas Yisrael. So he says to her, "Harei at bas chorin," but he doesn't want to free the ubar. So he makes the following stipulation. He says, "Uvladech," the fetus in your stomach, Eved, he remains my Eved. So the question now, Machlokas Tanoim, can he split between her and the Vlad? Havlad Kimosa, according to Divrei Rabbi Yosef Glili maintains he can't split between her and the Vlad. It's an either or situation, all or nothing, I should say. So therefore, Rabbi Yosef Glili says that the Shichrur is automatically chal on the Vlad as well, even against his will. Which sounds like, to me at least, the principle called Ubar Yerech Imo, that the Ubar is like part of the body of the mother. Chacham Omrim Dvar Kayamin. According to the Chachamim, we can make that split, and we could say the following, that even though the mother is now Meshuchreres, the Vlad remains an Eved. Mishum Shenemar. And now the question is, where does this Mishum Shenemar go on? Is it going back on Rav Yosef Glili? Or is it going on Chachamim? Ha'isha v'yiladea ti'eladonea. So if it's Chachamim, it's a very strange quote, because the quote seems to indicate that the Isha and the Vlados are one entity. How could you split between the two? And therefore the Gemara clarifies this by saying, my Talmudah, how did the Chacham derive their conclusion that you can split between the Shikhr of the mother and the Vlad remains an Eved, based on this pasuk, Rava, but rather ad Rabbi Yossi Aglilu. That drasha is an explanation not of the last shita quoted, but rather the first shita, that of Rabbi Yossi Aglilu, that you cannot split between the aim and the vlad, because Aisha Viladea indicates that as long as she's a shivcha, then the Vlad that she gives birth to is also an Eved to the same and owned by the same Adon, by the same master. But he cannot now go ahead and be Meshacher the Shivcha and retain his ownership on the Vlad. And that leads us to the Mishnah here on Daf Samach Tes. Now, in an earlier Mishnah, back on Daf Samach Vav, we spoke about the halacha and the status of a mamzer. A mamzer, the Torah says in Parashas Ki Teitze, lo yovo mamzer b'kal Hashem gam dor asiri lo yovo lo b'kal Hashem, which means that not only is there an Isser on the mamzer to marry a Jewish woman, but also the generations throughout, going up and down, are all mamzerim. And the Mishnah now addresses the following question: is there any possible way, a method of being mitayer mamzerim? What does that mean, mitayer mamzerim? Can you set up a situation where the child of the mamzer will not be a mamzer? And that's the famous sheet of Rabbi Tarfa. Yechole mamzer litar. How can you possibly be mitayer such that the psul of mamzer will not be passed on to the zera? Now, keep in mind that we're talking about a male mamzer, not a mamzer. So we're going to pick up the case of mamzers a little bit later on. Ketzad, mamzer shenasa shivcha. If the mamzer goes ahead and marries a shivcha knanis. Now what happens is, in this case, somehow the vlad is miyuchas to the mother and not to the father. So what happens? The mamzer marries a shivcha knanis, and now the child of that marriage has the status of an Eved. Why? Because he picks up the yichus of his mother rather than the father. This is brilliant, because then Shichuru, now he gives a get Shichur to his own son, who is the son of a Shifra Knanis, and therefore he's an Eved, he's not a Mamzer. He's not miyuchas to his father. Is Nimtza ben Chorin. Now the son, when he receives the get shechur, is a ben chorin. He's like a regular eved who receives a get shechur. He now can marry a bas Yisrael. Now it's unclear, and this is going to be the sugya, as to whether or not, according to Rabbi Tarfon, you're allowed to do this l'chatchila. Is a mamzer allowed to marry a shivcha knanis? Or is, in a funny sort of sense, Rabbi Tarfon is doing a harama in which the mamzer illegally married a shivcha knanis, but achieves this great goal of being Matara's children. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Hareze Eved Umamzer. Rabbi Eliezer says that the child of this marriage is going to be miyuchas to both his mother and his father. So as far as the yichus to his mother is concerned, he's an Eved, because his mother is a shivcha. But at the same time, he picks up the yichus, in this case the pagam of bias kol of mamzer from his father, so he inherits from his father the status of a mamzer. He's not in great shape, because even if the father now is meshacher him, removing his status as an eved, which he inherited from his mother, he still remains a mamzer because of his relationship to the father. The Gemara raises the following suffix: Rabbi Tarfon lechatchila ka'amar, o di'eved ka'amar. When Rabbi Tarfon maintains that the mamzer should marry a shivcha knanis, was he saying it lechatchila, meaning that there's no violation whatsoever? And even though a mamzer is not allowed to marry a bas Yisrael, that's only because she's kosher, she's a kshera. But as far as marrying a shivcha is concerned, the shivcha is not allowed to be married to a Jewish man who has yichus, without a pagam of yichusin, because the Torah says again in Parashas Kitetse, v'lo yeh kadesh mibnei Yisrael. However, that isur, according to this tzad, the first tzad of l'chatchila komar, does not apply to a mamzer. Why? Because if the mamzer is marrying a shivcha, so she doesn't have yuchsin, but he too doesn't have yuchsin, because he's a mamzer. In other words, both a shivcha and a mamzer have something in common. They're both psulei kol. They cannot enter to Kal Yisrael. So it could be that between the two, they can have a marriage relationship. Oh, di'eved kamar. Maybe what Rabbi Tarfon has in mind is that b'di'eved, if the mamzer violated the Isur, he was not allowed to marry a shivcha. Even a mamzer is enjoined over the level of Yeh Kadesh, and therefore, once he got married, b'di'eved, the children will not be mamzerim, but l'chatchila for sure he's enjoined from marrying a shivcha. And the Gemara is now going to try to quote a brisa to prove that Rabbi Tarfon had in mind even l'chatchila, and it's mutter for the mamzer to marry a shivcha knanis. Toshma, we learned in the brisa, Amru lo, the Chachamim said to Rabbi Tarfon, according to your logic, that the mamzer is marrying a shivcha, tiharta es hazcharim, velo tiharta es hanekevos. You were successful, perhaps, if the child of this mamzer married to a shivcha is a male child, fine. Then the male child is no longer a mamzer because, according to Rabbi Tarfon's logic, he inherits the status of his mother, namely he's an eved. But if, let's say, the child of this marriage will be a nekeva, that will not help. Why? Because the Gemara thinks that there's an isur to get married over here. In the case of a mamzer who's a male, he can go ahead and find himself in a place where nobody recognizes him. And he can present himself as if he's an eved, false representation, and he can marry a shivcha. So he has what's called a takana. So the proof here from the brisa is just the opposite. It's going to prove that Rabbi Tarfon never said l'chatchila that a mamzer is allowed to marry a shivcha knanis. He was only offering a method of harama in which the mamzer could dress himself up as an eved, go to a place where nobody recognizes him, and get married to a shivcha. But if a woman has the status of a mamzeres, she'll never get away with marrying an eved, because a woman doesn't usually go to a far-off place and make a tachbula and arama in order to get married. That's not the way a Jewish girl would go ahead and get married. So therefore, since locally, where the woman is, and she's a mamzeres, they're not going to allow her to marry an eved, so then the whole enterprise of Yecholim Mamzer Litar, according to Rabbi Lazar, according to Rabbi Tarfon, is not going to work. It works for a mamzer because he could disguise himself, present himself illegitimately, fabricate that he is an eved, but he can't work for a nekeva if she's a mamzeres. So the Gemara is now medayik from the argument of the Chachamim against Rabbi Tarfon. What was the shita Rabbi Tarfon? If Rabbi Tarfon allowed a mamzer to marry a shivcha, then mamzeres nami tinosiv leavda. Then, by virtue of the same heter, applying it logically and consistently, a mamzer is allowed to marry an eved, and therefore yecholim mamzer litar, even in the case of a mamzeres and a kev. The Gemara rejects it now. It's very possible that Rabbi Tarfon holds that even lechatchila you're allowed to do this. And what did the Chachamim mean? What was the import of their counter argument? They weren't saying that you need tachbulos and the mamzer has to appear somewhere far away and show himself up as an eved. Forget about all that. And a mamzeres can't do that, right? But rather, what was the kavod of the Chachamim in their argument against Rabbi Tarfon? Is that even a mamzeres who get married to an eved, the zera of that marriage, a mamzeres to an eved, will still be a mamzer. Why? Because the child of this marriage is going to pick up the yuchsin of the mother. That's what Rabbi Tarfon said. So in a case of a mamzer marrying a shivcha, the child of that marriage is going to pick up the status of the mother, and therefore he's an eved, which is great. And now he's allowed to marry a Jewish girl, and you finish with mamzeres. But in the case of a mamzeres, if she gets married to an eved, which again she's allowed to do according to the Gemara's argument now, but nevertheless the child of that marriage will pick up the same yichus as the mother. The mother's mamzeres, and therefore the child will be a mamzer. And the reason for this is because eved ein lo chayes. When she marries an eved Knani, there's no yichus to an eved Knani. The zera is not misyaches to the father who's an eved Knani. And the reason for this is a sugya back on Daf Samaches with regard to Eliezer Eved Avram, because in the Parsha Vayera it says Shvu lachem po machamor, and Chazal darshan Ama doma lechamor. And what's the equation between Ama doma lechamor, between Eliezer, who is an Eved, and a Chamor? It means that he has no yichus. Just like a Chamor has no yichus, so too an Eved has no yichus. And therefore, a Behema who's not miyuchas to his father, so too an Eved is not miyuchas to his father. So in a mamzer, a case of a male mamzer who marries a Shivcha Knanis, then the marriage will produce an Eved. Why? Because there's no Eved whose yichus is completely null and void. So therefore there's a takana. But in the case of a mamzeres, if she marries an Eved, then the Eved has no yichus, and therefore the child will be yichus to his mother, who's a mamzeres. So you can't be mitayr. So basically at this point in the Gemara, there's no final conclusion as to our original question. Hearing a plane going on, as to whether, according to Rabbi Tarfon, a mamzer is allowed to marry a shivcha. We don't know. We had a proof that we thought that the Chachamim by virtue of their argument against Rabbi Tarfon, were indicating that Rabbi Tarfon never allowed it. Just the Eved goes out. I'm sorry, the Mamzer goes out and he disguises himself. We rejected that, but we still have no final proof one way or the other. Toshma. Now the Gemara is going to quote a story, and from this story, we're going to try to bring a proof that Rabbi Tarfon allows a Mamzer to marry a Shivcha L'Chatchila. The Ushpezichna, which is a host, the Rabbi Simloi stayed in an inn, and the owner of the inn, where he was a visitor, was a mamzer. The Amalei, and Rabbi Simloi tells his host the following: I got an eitzah for you. Iakdam toch. If you were to come to me before you got married, tiartinu lebinach, I could have set you up with my eitzah. I would have given you the proper advice and guidance, and you could be matar your children from mamzeros. Now it's a little bit too late because you're already married. So the Gemara analyzes this. It makes sense that Rav Simloi would give this eitzah to the owner of the inn if lechatchila mamzer is allowed to marry a shivcha. If you're going to say the other way, that it's also for a mamzer to marry a shivcha, and only b'di'evet if he went ahead and he violated that Isur and he married the shivcha, that's where Rabbi Tarfon says that the children will be mitar the children. Mind you, how could Rabbi Simloi possibly entertain an eitzah to a person to be mitar zera by telling him to violate this Isur and have a mamzer marry a shivcha? He would never dream of giving a guidance that would entail violating an Isur, and the Gemara rejects. It could be that Rav Simloi had a slightly different kavanah. The mansiv le eitzah, when Rav Simloi is giving an eitzah to his ashpekazoi, to the mareach, he was telling him to steal something. Now, again, I'm not sure why he's allowed to tell him to steal something. Maybe it means he'll steal and then ultimately he'll pay back. But you have to know, I think we paskin that Gonev Amanas Lahashiv is still a violation of Gneva. Anyway, let's just get by the simple pshat in the Gemara. Zil Gnov, what he was telling the mamzer, the host, was go ahead and steal, and his davin be Eved Ivri. What's going to happen is that Bezdin is going to sell you as an Eved Ivri. Now that only applies to the case of a ganav who doesn't have money to pay for the geneva. So it could be because the pasuk says in Mishpatim, Ein lo, if he doesn't have money to repay the nignav, then v'nimkar b'genevasa. So an Eved Ivri is sold by Bezdin by virtue of the fact that he stole and he doesn't have money to pay. And that's indicated by the pasuk in Parshas Mishpatim. Fine. So we're going to derive the conclusion that now again we have to emphasize we're talking about an Eved Ivri, and an Eved Ivri is allowed to marry a Shifra Knanis. So a mamzer, if he can transform himself to an Eved Ivri, in brackets, by stealing and not having money to pay back, and Bezdin will sell him as an Eved Ivri is allowed to marry a Shifra Knanis. And that's exactly what Rav Simloi was guiding this mamzer. He's telling him, you know how you can marry a Shifra Knanis beheter, and Memela, the children will be avodim like her, is all you have to do is you have to make yourself into an Eved Ivri. So that once you're an Eved Ivri and you marry a Shifra Knanis, when you're Meshachrer, the children of the Shifra Knanis, they become Yisraelim Ksherim, and they're no longer Mamzerim because the Yichus is going to be after the mother. Now, all of this assumes that at the time of Rav Simloi, there was an entity called an Eved Ivri. And in truth, an Eved Ivri only applies, like today, for example, we don't have an Eved Ivri, because it only applies when the Yovel is Noeg. And once Sancheiriv sent us out into Golus, that terminated the validity of Yovel. So Yovel is no longer active today. And if Yovel is not active, then the entire enterprise of Eved Ivri doesn't exist today. And that's the Gemara's objection here. How could Rav Simlai, who lived after the Churban, and certainly after Yovel was no longer Noeg, how could he possibly advocate becoming an Eved Ivri? You can't become an Eved Ivri. Ubishnei, meaning during the years, the lifetime of Rabbi Simlai, Eved Ivri Mihava, Vamamar, we have a Bryce in Masechet Erchin on Daf Chav Tes, Ein Eved Ivri Noeg El Bizman Shayovel Noeg. The Torah says in the Parsha of Eved Ivri, this is in Vayikra, Parshas Bahar in Perek Chafei, Ad Shnas HaYovel Yavod Imach. And this pasuk could only be activated Bizman Shayovel Noeg, because it says explicitly Ad Shnas HaYovel. Now, from the time of Sancheiriv, when he sent us into Golus, they terminated the counting of the Yovelos. So we don't have Yovel Bizman Hazeh. Now, Rabbi Simlai lived after Churban Beis Hamikdash. I'm talking about the second Churban, obviously. And therefore, he couldn't have possibly have given an Eitzah to this Mamzer that he should steal and get sold as an Eved Ivri, because there is no Eved Ivri. So therefore, the Gemara now comes back and says that what Rav Simlai was advocating was that Lechatchili should marry a Shivcha. Elalav Shmamina, Rabbi Tarfa Lechatchila Komer Shmamina. The Gemara comes to the final conclusion that Rabbi Tarfon permitted a mamzer to marry a Shivcha Knanis, and therefore he could be mitayar his children because they're miyuchas to the mother. They have the status of an Eved, and then he can be Meshacher the Eved. Because otherwise there's no way of justifying Rav Simlai's Eitzah that he gave to the mamzer. You can't tell me that he told him to steal something and get sold as an Eved Ivri, because Rav Simlai already lived at a period of time in Jewish history after the termination of Eved Ivri. The only thing he could have possibly given to an Eitzah is to marry a Shivcha Knanis, meaning that an Eved Ivri is allowed to marry a Shivcha Knanis. Now, in our Mishnah, there's a discussion, shall we say, a controversy between Rabbi Tarfon and Rabbi Eliezer as to whether or not you can solve the problem of Mamzerus by having the Mamzer marry a Shivcha. According to Rabbi Tarfon, the Vlad is an Eved like his mother, and therefore after he's Meshacher the son is Yisrael Kosh, but according to Rabbi Eliezer, the Pagam in the child will be not only that which he inherits from the mother, which means he's an Eved, but also that which is passed on to him from the father, which means he's an Eved Mamzer. So we have good news from Mamzerim, and that is that a Mamzer is allowed to marry a Shivcha Knanis. Now it seems to me, and I'd love to be 100% sure about this, that you can have a Shivcha Knanis even in our time. Although there's no Eved Ivri, because Eved Ivri depends upon Yovel, but you could possibly have a Shivcha Knanis.
Oh.
In other words, take a Goyata, a non-Jewish woman, and make a kinyan on her as a Shivcha. Now, she would have to undergo what I call a partial gerus. She would show up in front of a Bezdin Shel Yisrael and declare that she's willing to be miskayeres as a shivcha. And this would be a great eitzah for a mamzer to be mitayar himself. So I don't know. I didn't get a chance to research this. So here in Israel, they call it Eravon Mugbal, with limited liability. Because I remember there was a whole parsha here with the chief rabbi of the army. I'm not going to go into detail because I have smicha from him, so I don't want to say anything bad about him. But he had this whole thing in which he tried to be mater mamzer, who was a very high officer in the army, And it was a whole controversy. I don't know if you know what I'm referring to, piece of history. Why didn't he simply, approach it like Rabbi Tarfon? The Gemara seems to assume we paskin like it. So I don't know. Now we get back to the Mishnah. Rabbi Eliezer Omer Harei Zeh Eved Mamzer. Okay, Rabbi Eliezer says that the child of this marriage between a mamzer and a shivcha is both an eved and a mamzer. Omer Rabbi Eliezer, my time of Rabbi Eliezer. So the Amor Rabbi Eliezer is going to reveal the underlying logic that underlies the ruling of Rabbi Eliezer the Tan. Because if not for a special pasuk, which Rabbi Eliezer is going to try to bring and justify Rabbi Eliezer, we would have said that the vlad of a shivcha is misyaches to the mother. How does Rabbi Eliezer know? How does Rabbi Eliezer know that the vlad of a shivcha is also misyaches to the father? The Omar Kro, because the pasuk in the parsha of Mamzer, that's in Dvarim Perikov Gimel, Gam Dor Asiri Lo Yovo Lo B'Kal Hashem. We're going to darshan the language of the pasuk says Yovo Lo, that a Mamzer extends to the door that comes afterwards his status, meaning his status as a mamzer. The pugam of the father, who's a mamzer, is now passed on to his children, and that's called in the language of the Mikra, Yavolo. Halach acher psulo. In other words, the Torah is saying that the psul of mamzeris will be passed on to the next generation. The Torah doesn't differentiate between a male and a female. The Torah is saying that if one of the parents, whether it's the mother or the father, is a mamzer, then halach acher psula. Notice the yichus always goes lipsul, meaning if either one of the parents, the mother or the father, is a mamzer, the child is a mamzer. So therefore, even the vlad of a shivcha, although the vlad of shivcha has the status of her mother or his mother, and he's an eved or a shivcha, but nevertheless, he still has a yichus to his father as far as mamzeris is concerned, and therefore he's an eved mamzer. And the Gemara now enhances our understanding of this drasha of lo, meaning yovo lo, according to Rabbi Tarfon, who rejects Rabbi Eliezer. For Rabbanon, now here's a very unusual language in the Gemara. The Gemara is using the word Rabbanon, but it's referring to Rabbi Tarfon. Of course, we already paskin like Rabbi Tarfon, so he's now the Rabbanon. And he holds the Vlad is an Eved, and he's not a Mamzer, and we only use the yichus of the mother, not of the father. So what's he going to do with this pasuk, with this drasha? Hahu, that pasuk, Gam Dor Asiri Lo Yovel B'Kal Hashem, is not a reference to a Mamzer who married a Shivcha, but rather the Yisrael Shenosa Mamzeres. A Yisrael kosher marries a Mamzeres, which of course is a violation of a Lav Doraisa, Lo Yovel B'Kal Hashem. But Salkatayt Chamina, I would have entertained the possibility that the Vlad is kosher. Why? Because the father is kosher, even though the mother's a Mamzeres. And in Yichsun, we are always kover according to the father. Why? Because the pasuk says at the beginning of Numbers of Bamidbar, Perek Dalet, it says Lemishpachosam leBeis Avosam, which means Beis Avosam, that the Banim are Misyachsim liavoseim. And therefore, I would have said that in this case that a Yisrael marries a Mamzeres, the child is a Yisrael and not a Mamzer. Also, lo, therefore the pasuk says Lo Yovel Lo in the parsha of Mamzer to teach me Afke. Take out this din, meaning undermine the din of a Vlad of a Mamzeres who's married to a Yisrael from Shar Vlodos. And what it means to say is that only when both of the parents are ksherim, then the yichus goes to the father. But the Vlad of an imam mamzeres, of a psula, is misyaches le'imam mamzeres. So we don't derive from this pasuk that a Vlad of a shivcha and a mamzer is like the father and he's a mamzer. That's Rabbi Eliezer. But according to the Rabbanan, or to be more specific, Rabbi Tarfon, it's only coming to teach you that if the mother is a mamzeres, the child is a mamzer, even though the father is a Yisrael. So the Gemara now continues. And the Gemara wants to analyze the drasha of Rabbi Eliezer that the vlad of a shivcha and a mamzer is an eved mamzer, and he's miyuchas both to his mother, and therefore he's an eved, and to his father, therefore he's a mamzer. We need this pasuk to teach us that if Yisrael marries a mamzeres, then the child is a mamzer, despite the fact that the father is a Yisrael. So, frek the Gemara, how's Rabbi Eliezer going to darshan this? And the Gemara answers, Rabbi Eliezer wants to prove it. Lav afal gav de kosav. Even though the pasuk says mishpachosa lebeis avosa, which means the vlad is miyachis to his father, nevertheless also the pasuk of Yavo lo v'afke, and takes it out of the case of Yisrael marrying a mamzeres, that the vlad is a mamzer like the mother, is hachinami here too, in a vlad of a mamzer is shivcha, afal gav d'chsiva isha v'yoladea tia ladonea, which seems to teach us that the vlad of a shivcha is misyachis to her, but not to him, meaning the father. Also Yavo lo v'afke, and once again the pasuk of lo is coming to be motzi, the vlad who's born from a mamzer and a shivcha, from the general category of lodos hashivcha, and there's a yichus to the father for Rabbanon. And the Gemara finally asks Rabbi Tarfon, he doesn't want to compare the vlad of a shivcha to the vlad of Yisraelis. Why? Kol vlad b'mei shivcha knanis ki vlad b'mei behemadon. And just like the vlados of behema have no shaykhs to the father, so too the vlad of a shivcha has no shaykhs to the father. And therefore, even though the father was a mamzer, the child is not a mamzer. And this leads us to the fourth and last chapter of Masechet Kiddushin, which is called Asara Yuchsin. So let's just give a quick and, shall we say, superficial introduction to this last parak of Kiddushin, which has really 6 different parts to it. The first part is actually a continuation of what we learned before in the previous parak, and we're talking about the different types of Yuchsin b'Yisrael, under what circumstances is there a heter to get married, under what circumstances is there no heter to get married. Then we move on to the second part of this parak, which is a case where we don't know a person's yichus, and we do what's called a bedika, and we have to apply the principle of chazaka to figure out minastam, is he a kosher, or he might be apostle, and if we have to do bedika. The third section is we're going into different specific yuchsin, which are kshem lekuhuna, and which are apostle lekuhuna. And when is a person apostle lekuhuna? So until now, we've been discussing psulei kol, and now we're moving over in the third section to psulei kuhuna. And then the fourth section is about whether a person is to believe about his son, to say and testify that his son is a kosher apostle. Fifth section is about the dinim of sfekos in Leidas Kiddushin. And finally, the last chelik, which is the 6th chelik, is the Isur Yichud. So the Mishnah says the following: Asara Yuchsin Olu mi Bavel. As we know, the second aliyah was that of Ezra and Nehemiah, and he came from Bavel, and he brought different categories of mishpachos, 10 in total. And what are they? Number 1, Kohanim. Number 2, Leviim. Number 3, Yisraelim. Number 4, Chalolim. Chalolim means a Kohen that was possible because Nischalel Mikdushas Kahuna. Let's say, for example, if a Kohen marries a Grusha, the child is a Chalal. Gerei, which means Gerim. Charure, which is an Eved Kanani after Shechur. Mamzere is anyone that's born from a Bias Isur Kares. Nisinim are the Givaonim that were converted at the time of Yoshua, and David made a Gzera that we're not allowed to marry them. Shtuki Vasufi. These are types of Safek Mamzer. So all of these will be explained one by one in the Mishnah. Kohen Levi Yisrael Mutar Lavu Zebazeh. So Kohen's allowed to marry Yisrael, Yisrael's male and Kohen, and male Levi, they're all together bad. Levi, Yisraeli, Chalole, Geri v'Charuri Mutarim Lovos. A ger or a Charuri is allowed to get married to a Levi or to Yisraeli. And again, keep in mind that a Haruri is an Eved Knani Shenishtachri. And that person who's a Haruri is allowed to marry a Levi or a Yisrael, but not a Kohen. A Kohen is enjoined from marrying a Ger. Or in this case, a Gioris. But those who have a lower status, an inferior status of Yuchsin, for example, a Ger, or an Evet Shenishtachra, or a Mamzer, a Nosin, a Shtuki Vasufi, they are allowed to marry one or the other. Now, this is l'chora a very difficult line in the Mishnah to understand, because a Mamzer is not allowed to come into the Kol, and that's based on the Pasuk Lo Yovo Mamzer B'Kal Hashem. And yet, he's allowed to marry Gerim, or Avodim Mishuchrorim. It must be that he considers that Gerim and Mishuchrorim are not considered Kol, and they're not included, therefore, in the Isur for the Mamzer to marry Lo Yovav Mamzer B'Kal Hashem. He also can marry a Shtuki Vasufa, but there's Safek Mamzer. So why is that allowed? I mean, maybe he's marrying someone who's not a Mamzer. Only heaven knows whether this person is a Mamzer or not. But for this, we have a drasha, which Mr. Shem will get to. Rashi invokes it here, and that is Kahol Vadai Kriya Kol, but not Kahol Safek. So a Safek Mamzer is not considered a Mamzer. The Mishnah now explains, what's a Shtuki and what's an Asufi? Shtuki is Kol Shu Makers Imo Ve'eno Makers of. In other words, we know that this mother, the mother who gave birth to this child, had znus, and we don't know who the father of the child is. And that's called a Shtuki. Why Shtuki? A Shtuki means that if you call so-and-so his father, then the mother is going to shut you up, mishaskosa. She's not going to be very eager to reveal who her partner was in that Maises Nus. What's Asufi? And this Asufi reminds me of that famous book. What's the name of it? Cradle. I forget the other word of the cradle, but anyway, it's, Bamboo Cradle. You remember that book? Bamboo Cradle.
Yeah.
Asufi is Kol Shenesaf Min Ashuk. As you find a baby that was left stranded in the shuk. And Eino Makalos of Loasima. We don't know who the father is or the mother is. That opens up a whole vista, a whole list of possibilities, a floodgate, floods the gates. However, the Asufi who was left there, we don't know why he was left there. Maybe they were embarrassed because he was a mamzer, or maybe it's a non-Jewish child. I mean, there are many possibilities.
Right.
Abishol Yikar L'Shtuki Biduki. Abishol changed the name of a Shtuki, where we don't know who his father is, to that of a Biduki, which means that we need Bidika. Meaning, Abishol is Mekil with regard to a Shtuki. What's his kula? He says, you know what? Don't call him a Shtuki, where we don't identify his father. Call him a Biduki, which means that we can implement an effective Bidika, and we will interrogate the mother. And if the mother says that she had this znus relationship with a kosher, lekosher nivalti, then we believe her. And that's called Bari Vishema Lav Bar. That's called Bari Vishema Bariot. That since she has the tinus Bari and she claims she knows who the boil was and he was a kosher, she's believed to be Machsha the Vlad, and therefore we call the Vlad a Beduki, relying on her testimony as to the kashrus of the Vlad. Gemara says, I saw Yuchsin Olumi Bavel, my area detani Olumi Bavel, listening. Whole Chuli Eretz Yisrael. Why does the Mishnah use the word Olu? Why not Holchu? Milsaga Vurcha Kamashbal, and the Mishnah wants to tell me a Chidush. That Eretz Yisrael is Gvoa Mikol Harotzos. So when you make Aliyah, you're going to the highest of all lands. Now, whether or not we take this literally, and it means that on a geological level, Eretz Yisrael is on the highest of the lands, I don't know. Kedisani, we learned in the Brisa, the Pasuk says in Parshas Shoftim, it says, Ki polei mimcha davar lemishpat v'kamta v'lisa. You get up and you go to the Lishkas HaGozis outside the Beis HaMikdash for the Beis Din of Ayin Aleph, the Sanhedrin HaGedolah, Asher Yivchar Hashem Elokecha. So it means v'olisa that you go up. Is Malamich Beis HaMikdash Gavo Mikol Eretz Yisrael. The highest point in Eretz Yisrael is the Mikdash, and Eretz Yisrael Gavo Mikol Harotzos. And that's what the Mishnah wanted to teach me, Derech Agav, by using the word Ol. Frek Gemara, Bishlema Beis HaMikdash Gavo Mikol Eretz Yisrael. I can prove to you from a pasuk in Chumash that Enochinami Beis HaMikdash is the highest point in Eretz Yisrael. Sharei Hainu Dichsiv. The pasuk says in Varim Yud Zayin. Here we turn to Samach Tesamid Beis Ki Polei Mechad Davar L'Mishpat, etc., etc. And it says Divrei Rivos Bisharecha V'Kam Tavel Lisa El Amokom Asher Yivchar Hashem Elokecha. So the pasuk is talking about Rivos Bisharecha, and Bisharecha is referring to all of Eretz Yisrael, and it says V'Olisa Al Amokom Asher Yivchar Hashem Elokecha. It means Aliyah to the Beis HaMikdash. Ela Eretz Yisrael Gavo Mikol Harotzos Minolan. What's the source from which we derive that Eretz Yisrael is higher than all the other nations? And the Gemara seems to be taking this very, very seriously. Tichsiv, a pasuk in Yirmiyah Tes Zayin, with regard to foretelling the ultimate geula. Lachein hinei yomim ba'imnu Hashem lo yeomer hayod od chai Hashem asher hela b'nei Yisrael me'eretz Mitzrayim ki im chai Hashem asher hela v'asher hevi es b'nei Yisrael me'eretz Tzafon umikol harotzos asher idachtim sham. So it says asher hela me'eretz Tzafon, which is a reference to Bavel. And then it says, Umikol Harotzos, I will gather in the exiles from all the different nations that populate the globe, and it's all going to be Hela. That's the key word, Hela, which means that Eretz Yisrael is Gvoa Mikol Harotzos. Kasha, I'm reading to you a footnote here in the Masechet. It says Asher Olu or Hela, but it also says Asher Hevi. Hevi implies that it's not an Aliyah. Im Kain Minayim Lemedim She'eretz Yisrael Gavo Mikol Harotzos. So the Netziv Miv Halojim says the following, that Hakavoni she'eretz Yisrael gvoa meharotzos shesviva avolo b'yachas l'shara harotzos shelegabeim nemar v'yasher hevi. So if you're talking about Iran, then you're talking about Eretz Yisrael higher than Iran, or Bavel for that matter. That's Asher Hela, because that's already the Arotzal Shemisviva b'mapike. But, says the Netziv, as far away lands, let's say people come in Aliyah from Canada, right? If they don't get killed by the Hamas in Canada, I shouldn't say. Anyway, I don't know if there's more Hamas in London, England, or in Toronto, Canada. I don't know. It's terrible.
Probably London.
So those people who come in Aliyah, I'm not sure if they're going to go up to Eretz Yisrael, because that's not Artzos HaSmuchos.
Right.
The Chassam Sofer raises our question that we implied. B'mitzius yesh haratzos hagvos mi Eretz Yisrael. How could the Gemara claim that Eretz Yisrael is the highest of all the lands? I mean, keep in mind that Chassam Sofer is before the Netziv by, maybe, I don't know, maybe I'm exaggerating, 50 years, but he's certainly before the Nitzir. So he didn't have the Nitzir. And he writes, HaKavana, Shekevan Sheha Olam Dome L'Tapuach. Okay, this I never understood this. Maybe you'll help me with this. The globe itself is like a tapuach, meaning it has a certain, what's the word I'm looking for? Okay, we'll call it circular, but I'm looking for a different word. Eretz Yisrael, Mokom HaMikdash, Merkazo Shel Olam, they're in the middle of the globe. Therefore, Kol Ma Shesoviv Hu Nomach Mimenu. So if you hold up a globe and you put Eretz Yisrael and the Mikdash on top of the globe, then they are above everything else. Yeah, but that's only, when the Earth rotates on its axis. That's, I don't know how many days of the year that's going to happen. Okay. So let's just add a little bit of Abaye and Rava here, and then we'll call it a night or a day by you. Itmar, Abaye Omar Olu Me'alem Tnan. When the Mishnah says Olu Mi Bavel, it means Mirtzonam. They had their will to leave Bavel, and they made that decision on their own. They weren't compelled to make Aliyah to Eretz Yisrael. Rav Amar He'elum Tnan. He'elum means they were brought up. Ezra brought them up from Bavel against their will. And the Gemara explains the machlokas. Kamifli Givir Rabbi Lazar, they are arguing about the statement of Rabbi Lazar. Diamar Rabbi Lazar lo ola Ezra vi Bavel achasa kisoles nekia viola. So let's start with Rava. I'm jumping a little bit ahead of myself. Shalom Kesed. Rava accepted the principle of Rabbi Lazar, namely that He'elum Bal Karcha, and Rabbi Eliezer was of the opinion that what Ezra did was he cleaned out Bavel of all the psulim, and he was mafresh them. And once having done so and made that selection process, then he brought them to Eretz Yisrael. Abai Leslie de Rabbi Lazar, he never accepted the principle of Rabbi Lazar that Ezra made Bavel into Soles Nakia, meaning he cleaned out all the psulim, but rather they came to Eretz Yisrael on their own initiative. Whereas Rava, Isla, he accepted Rabbi Lazar, and therefore Ezra was Menake Bavel Mipsulim, he was Mafresh the Psulim, and He'elum Bal Korcha. Okay, then, so even though we're in the middle of a sugya, but I think we'll stop here.
Okay, Shkoya.
Okay, we really accomplished a lot. We finished the third parak, and we made a good haskalah to the fourth parak.
Okay, good. Shkoya.
So let's hope we hear better news. It's been very, very rough here.
I know.
Yeah, call to regards.